Welcome to Job Ready. Our guest today is Kevin Stump, and he's the Chief Program Officer at Education Design Lab, which is a national nonprofit that co-designs and tests education to workforce models with a focus on equity and economic mobility. Kevin brings a career of systems change experience across policy, workforce development, and higher education, including doctoral research on the community college presidents who are leading transformation right now. Kevin, welcome to Job Ready.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here.
We're glad to have you. Kevin, I want to start out. I've been really excited to speak with you, especially since your research is so fresh. Your systems change experience is consistent over many years. But I noticed something really interesting that the lab says, and I'd like to grant our audience beginning with that. The majority of today's learners aren't the 18-year-olds heading out to a residential campus, right? They're working adults, caregivers, first-generation students, and you've given them the name they deserve, the new learner majority. What does that reframe reveal about how higher education is changing and needs to evolve?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. This is kind of a really fundamental part of the lab's theory of change and our values and our mission, which is really focused on facilitating upward economic mobility that is co-designed with and for, as we say, the new majority learner. And that is really to signal that the majority of learners today going through post-secondary education and workforce opportunities is really not who the system was designed for, which really reflects more of a mid-20th century construct. And it was really about helping facilitate, high school students into the university construct. And that lasted a good while, and there's still important work to do to strengthen even that leaky pipeline. High school students moving into intentional pathways-oriented higher education opportunities. But when you look today at who students are, they are working adults, right? They're parenting learners. They are young adults who have been disconnected from school and work for several years and need to be reconnected. They are immigrant learners. They are learners who are needing to reskill because their industry has changed. And so, when you're thinking about the design of colleges and of programs, they're at odds with the needs of the majority of people ultimately needing to access opportunity today.
Well, and I know for you guys, and you especially, Kevin, community colleges are the institutions moving fastest to serve these learners, right? I know that the community colleges are made in the image of the university, but they're increasingly the ones who are out ahead on the cutting edge. And I'd like to hear more about your research into these community college leaders, the presidents, that gets right at why some are seizing this moment and others aren't.
Yeah, so some of that research was really asking the question, how do sitting community college presidents who are change leaders and have been there for a certain number of time have accomplished, growth and upward movement in their outcomes, right? So that's kind of a simple criteria of what it means to be a change leader in community colleges today. But how are these leaders using intermediary organizations to facilitate transformation aligned towards the future of work, right? What do they believe needs to happen in order for them to facilitate change at their campus? And so we put out a framework maybe 2 years ago called the Future of Learning. And it's really kind of a simple inquiry-based framework that's asking kind of 5 basic design questions. How might we guarantee that all learners experience stackable skills-based pathways? How might we ensure that all skills and competencies are visible, right? So that learners know when you have student learning outcomes at the top of the syllabus, that actually translates to skills and competencies language that learners are then equipped to use in the labor market because they're speaking the same language that learners are speaking, for example. How do we ensure that learning is universally flexible with multimodal options? How do we ensure that learners have access to equitable support services, right? It's not just reserved for degree-seeking students. And when you look at community colleges, there are so many students that are not in a degree program, right? Some colleges, it's half of their student body is not in a degree program. They're in a shorter term workforce-oriented program. And then, of course, a big topic of conversation today around work-based learning and career-connected learning. But how do we ensure that all learners in all programs are having more and better access to employer-backed, career-connected, or work-based learning opportunities? How we do that at scale is a tremendous tremendous challenge when the kind of antiquated funding model doesn't really align to the needs of today's learner, right? How do we do that at scale when, as you said, community colleges were born in the image of the university, organized all around the Carnegie Hour, right? Built in the image of the university actually was really important to facilitate more seamless pathways from community colleges up to four-year universities, right? Really important kind of intentional design there. But community colleges don't have the mandate of research. They don't have that kind of bigger societal focus around civics and democracy as explicitly as the university construct does. And so community colleges were even born to be a workforce vehicle, right? And so, we've kind of seen over the last several decades this, increasing focus and maybe sometimes too slow of a shift to really recognize the role that community colleges are already positioned to play. But some of the complexities that they face are what leaders are now having to navigate through. And so when we put this framework in front of a number of leaders to really help validate that these are the right set of questions. It was very clear that these are all of the right things. In fact, one of the presidents who I interviewed looked at the framework and drew a parallel to when Nicholas Otto invented the four-stroke engine, right? There was this initial engine, and over the years following, it became perfected and ultimately got to a place where you're now driving the cars you're driving, kind of thing. And so, but the challenges of leadership in higher ed, as my research reinforced, was there's a need for a new generation of leadership, one that is more entrepreneurial minded, right? Thinking beyond just the degree focused programs that historically has kind of carried higher education. There's a need for leaders that are more conscious of the workforce needs and the more explicit alignment to the needs of their local economy. Again, not just kind of your traditional, I started in academia, I then became the chair and the dean and then the president, right? So we're seeing actually that when you look at some of the last several years of appointments where boards are saying, we need kind of a new type of leader to come in. And you're seeing that in some of the shift of these kind of presidential leadership development programs that are more explicitly focusing on workforce alignment now as a pillar, for example.
What are some of the most interesting things you hear coming out of that? I mean, you talked about
Hang on,
leaders
Jeff.
looking. Yeah,
Jeff, hang on. I want to follow up on the five things that Kevin just asked because I mean
the
to share with
framework.
us, yeah, the framework.
Yeah,
Because what I didn't hear, Kevin, and maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, was around AI. Because
Sure.
not in turn. Obviously, it's a topic dominating almost every aspect of our life today. But
Yeah.
how do we train the future of learning where learners are harnessing the power of AI and not being replaced by AI?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is a conversation that, as you're saying, is in every room, right? This question of AI. And so the way that we've looked at this framework as it's evolved, as AI continues to emerge and we continue to understand more of its capabilities, those questions don't change. It just becomes a matter of understanding how to use AI to better facilitate multimodal options, for example. How can we use AI that can better deliver services to learners who have historically been left out because of the antiquated funding model, right? Degree seeking students, workforce students. How do we use AI to better ensure that skills are visible, right? So it's not just student learning outcomes in the example that I named earlier, but it's like, is it a digital wallet? Is it a learning and employment record that can help us better store a learner and earner's credentials and skills that are validated and verified and so on, right? What are the AI capabilities behind all of that? And then I think the substance piece, the curriculum piece is then the question around how do we ensure that there are more and better opportunities that are across every program around career connected learning. And if we think about the future of work, AI is woven into every facet of life and work and society broadly. So for us, AI is kind of an overlay across all of these questions.
I want to dive a little bit further into that. So I've heard what you share so far, Kevin, is from how AI can be leveraged to improve the delivery of learning to the
Wonderful.
learners. But also as part of that, how do we move in AI into the whole college experience, whether it's at university or at community college, where they understand how to use the learners themselves, how to use AI to become more marketable, become more job ready, become more productive from day one, right? Because, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a career or an occupation today where AI doesn't have a force multiplier effect to it,
Yeah.
right? Because even when I fix things, I use Gemini to
Yeah.
record it, and then automatically it tells me how to do certain things better or where to search. So I'm curious more from that perspective in terms of the research that you guys done and how the presidents are, position AI um, as a tool, as a critical must-have tool for the learners.
Yeah, what you're pointing out is that is both how do we improve the delivery of learning and education, right? And it is also how is AI embedded into the student learning outcomes, right? How is it changing what you're learning and how you're learning? And that is part of the framework is the question around designing stackable skills-based pathways. So there are minimally a set of skills. And it's funny, if you think 15, 20 years ago, you kind of saw Microsoft Office Suite now, and now it's on every job description for the most part, right? There will be some version of that where there will be a baseline kind of expectation of a learner's understanding and use of AI. But ironically, what we hear from employers every day, increasingly so with AI, especially for younger learners, is around all of these durable skills that are needed to complement using AI in learning and in work, right? And so critical thinking, communication, collaboration, these are all areas of concern now as we get further and further, faster and faster into this new world of AI. And so when you look at a general education curriculum, a lot of those learning outcomes are already named. And so the work that colleges are now having to do, again, is the overlay of AI and looking at my curriculum and saying, okay, where does AI show up in this teacher education program? Where does AI show up in how we're educating the future manufacturing workers or healthcare workers, whatever the case is? And that's the work that colleges are needing to do. But there's so much unknown that it's appropriate for folks to be hedging a bit on what's next. It's like, how fast do we update our entire curriculum to focus on teaching people today's moment and what we understand with AI? Or how much should we continue to focus on ensuring that programs are producing people who can think critically, who can collaborate to solve problems? And so that's some of the disconnect that there's kind of two parallels of conversations happening. And so these things will come together when some of this becomes a little more real inside higher education.
Kevin, do you see employers or do you talk to employers who are working on kind of measuring those durable skills that you mentioned, the collaboration, the creativity? Like what's the cutting edge of thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work a lot with employers across, pretty much all sectors. And a lot of our approach is about strengthening the alignment between the employer and, talent demand and talent supply, right? So the employer and the community college or the university or the high school, whatever the case is. And we have a design tool, right? Our approach of using human-centered design means that we're centering learners next to employers, next to educators in the process of solving problems and innovating. And so we have a process or a tool in that process called the T profile. And the top of the T, ultimately through some engagement with the job description and with hiring managers, right, pulls out and organizes those critical priority durable skills that's specific to that job. Right. So oral communication, for example, may not be as critical in some sectors as it may be in a lot of healthcare jobs, for example. And then the bottom of the T, the vertical, are more of those technical skills that employers will say, like, no, we can train you for that. What we're having trouble with are those durable skills. And so we developed a program construct that we call micro pathways that are now scaling across community colleges. We're in about 15% of community colleges have embraced this model. And the micro pathway is really saying that we're going to bundle two or more credential of value in the industry that will both ensure the technical skills are visible and mapped, but also naming and credentialing those durable skills because they're that important to employers, because employers are validating and co-designing those programs with us.
I mean, that just sounds like something everybody ought to be doing. It feels essential if you're not going to get these self-directed tools automating out the human dimension of the workforce. Why do you think it is that that sort of powerful credentialing of these durable skills hasn't been more widely embraced and adopted? Why is it 15% and then 85% not, rather than the other way around? What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, well, I'll just say quickly too about the micro pathway model, right? And the
Yeah.
design criteria there, right? It's 2 or more stackable credentials, and the micro pathway needs to stack into the next step, right? So facilitating the short-term program stackability into the degree or the credit-bearing certificate is unfortunately not a systemic practice across higher education. It happens in pockets. It happens, in one department over another, right? And so, that is really a failure of higher ed today. And the good news is that there's a lot of momentum across the country to figure out how to do this more seamlessly so that a learner, for example, isn't needing to go through this hefty application process to help, apply to their college to give them a handful of credits towards their degree, which is validated and justifiable. And so there's a lot of work that's going into the stackability of programs, which aligns to the criteria of Workforce Pell that has come out. And so, there is momentum, maybe more than there, over the last couple of years, certainly, but Workforce Pell has kind of put a new bit of gasoline on the fire, if you will, because it requires, in order for colleges to unlock those dollars, it requires stackability, for example. And so, we're seeing a lot more movement from higher ed that's really, I think, being driven by changes in enrollment, changes in attitudes that learners have towards traditional programs and how they've been organized. And it's certainly being driven by a kind of a clarion call from employers to say, we need more skilled workers faster and opportunities to upskill people throughout their career. It's no longer, kind of your grandfather's job market that is like my grandfather worked for Bell Atlantic for 40 years. That is no longer the reality of our labor market. I think the question on why isn't there more of an adoption of these durable skills in part is because there hasn't been kind of a shared taxonomy and framework across the country to norm and what are they even. There are multiple frameworks. The Education Design Lab has a durable skills framework that we use that was developed from a lot of research with employers across the country several years ago. We have created micro credentials out of those, right? Again, to make those skills visible and more prominent. And so, but I think that there's a disconnect in language first. And then there's a consciousness that maybe wasn't always there that we're seeing kind of come to bear more and more today, right? That consciousness among higher education that actually these are what we need to focus on. And again, it's not to say that higher ed is not doing, good things at all. In fact, I would argue part of what's missing is that translation. Again, those gen ed, think of a gen ed curriculum, 120 credits to get a bachelor's degree, 60 credits to get an associate's degree, half of both, right? 30 credits for the associates, 60 for the bachelor's are gen ed curriculum. When you look at the student learning outcomes in any gen ed curriculum, they will translate pretty much to the labs or other durable skill frameworks. And so some of the consciousness is about articulating the skills when they're there. Again, so learners are able to speak that language that employers are looking to as well.
What
Hey,
needs to
Kevin,
happen?
the just follow up on that Gen Ed. So typically, and I'm not
Yeah.
saying this is across all the higher ed, but when a student enters into a 4-year program or a 2-year, typically, Gen Ed is the first layer, like the very basic layer. And then as you go deeper into the program, you gain the more technical component of the program. So in some way, mentally, you sort of Gen Ed is viewed as sort of like low value, designed to ease you into the program, and then the core or the meat of the program is later on. When what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that, and in your reference to the T, the technical, most employees, and we've heard this consistently as well. Yeah, we can teach the on the job, no problem at all. It's the horizontal, the top of the T, the durable skills, much harder to be taught or to be gained. So I guess my question to you is, should we flip that model a little bit where the beginning of any program is more about learning the technical and get your, and then as you go toward the end of your program where you are much closer to the workforce, you emphasize the durable skills as opposed to the current model right now. Because again, that's when it's most relevant, right? Because that's when you can't just take a course 4 years ago and then you sort of like forgot all about it by the time that you're ready to enter the workforce.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question, and I don't know that I have like a clean answer. I don't know that there is one, because I would imagine it could greatly depend on the programs themselves and the pathways and whatever. But I guess if I take a step back and think about what those durable skills are that employers are saying are missing, they're not just something that you can teach and check off, right? It's an ongoing kind of human development journey. So, right, communication, for example, collaboration and teamwork, critical thinking, right? So these are, what credentials do is give a snapshot in time for skills and competencies. And I think that snapshot in time piece is really important. And it's partly what's driving the need to create stackable, to kind of unbundle, if you will, and then repackage into stackable, snappable credentials that can, over a career, maybe lead to a bachelor's or a master's or whatever is appropriate. But I don't know that I would say, it's flipping the order of things. And in fact, it'd be an interesting question with a number of faculty, because I could also just imagine blending more of the experience, right? I could also imagine having both the foundational elements that Gen Ed gives you, but then maybe there's a more specific lens for critical thinking in advanced manufacturing or oral communication for a certified nursing assistant or something like that. And so that's a lot of what our work is with employers, is to put those durable skills in the context of the pathway that the learner is pursuing. And much of our work has been kind of reimagining what short-term workforce programs look like. That was what ultimately birthed the micro pathway construct that has kind of taken hold across community colleges in a relatively short amount of time. And the other thing I would just say too is and again, take a bigger step back and think about the generational shifts. You've got books like The Anxious Generation or The Disengaged Teen, right? These books kind of crystallize this moment that we're in where there's such misalignment between traditional education in K-12 and in higher ed with a very fast changing dynamic labor market. On top of that are societal shifts, right? You have young people coming up today looking behind them and seeing their millennial parents or their millennial cousins groan about graduating college with high student debt into a bad labor market in the Great Recession, right? That ripple effect and that American psyche has now caught up with us. And now we have people questioning if it's worth getting a 4-year degree or going to the university or going to college, right? That idea of just, I'm going to go to college or not is a problem. Colleges should be facilitating these bite-sized, stackable, snap-together learning experiences. If they don't, then you may have seen the partnership that was announced earlier this week. If they don't, the Khan Academy, TEDx, and ETS will eat their breakfast. And so those are the market pressures forcing some of the changes. And I think we're kind of at the beginning of this era. How fast it lasts will be interesting.
Kevin, what happens? We've heard durable skills referred to so many different ways, right?
Sure.
The whole contextual thing that you just brought up, and I think a lexicon issue, right? With, is it soft? Is it durable? Is it world ready? There's a number of these, and they all have a slightly different orientation, and some of them are really powerful and distinct from each other, right? But what needs to happen to create that universal context? Because that seems really important, and you guys must be thinking about this a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the question. And so I think we unfortunately in these macro conversations often jump to the solution, like more work-based learning, right? And we're not asking the right question sometimes. But if we were able to guarantee to every high school student in 9-12 and every matriculated learner in a college or anybody in a short-term workforce program, whatever it is, if we're able to guarantee that they're going to have more experiences that are career connected learning, that are closer to the industry that they might be working in or just exploring the world of work, we will tighten some of this divide, because just the language you need to get an internship, for example, or what you'll learn when you're career shadowing somebody in your community to learn more about that sector, or what you'll get from participating in a Ripen platform supported project, right? Like you're actually touching real experiences and you're engaging with real people who use the words that are used in work, I'm kind of speaking broadly, but like there's this gap, right, with the academy and the workforce. And so, if we're able to realize this vision where, tomorrow's future of learning is really guaranteeing all learners have access to work-based learning and not some like small effort. It is a fundamental shift in how we're delivering education in this country that is more aligned to the needs of the real workforce. And so that to me is a big piece that's missing and will help solve some of the gap that we're seeing.
Kevin, I'm fascinated when Jeff shared that you're coming on. I was fascinated by your organization and the tagline that you guys have, and is designing education toward the future of work, right? That's your tagline.
Correct.
What does that mean? If you can describe to us that sort of like a success statement, and then from there, help us understand where you think the gap is today.
Yeah. We talk about designing the future of education towards the future of work. I think is equally as important to that tagline that you're naming is how we do that and who we do that with. Right. So what we believe is that by centering folks closest to the problem, so in this case, students, learners, right, or workers, earners, right, whoever, next to employers and educators to co-design what the future looks like through our process, you're going to ultimately result in the most responsive model to all of these stakeholders that will have a much bigger effect than we can even realize. One example that we often use when we talk about human-centered design is the curb cut effect. So, to comply with disability laws, sidewalks were cut, if you remember, to create an easy kind of ramp for wheelchairs. And that was the focus of that policy. But it had a much bigger ripple effect that wasn't necessarily intentionally part of the initial design of that policy. Parents with strollers, right? Elderly with walkers, whatever the case is. So it had a bigger ripple effect. And so that's kind of core to our approach, is our belief that by centering people together and moving through a process that we will get to better solutions. But, a success statement, I guess, to oversimplify what we believe the world should look like, it really is, fast forwarding to what would be a skills-based education system that can help facilitate lifelong learning and upskilling opportunities explicitly aligned to economic mobility. In other words, work. And a lot of that vision does rely on employers and the demand side to change their practices too. I sometimes get disappointed when I see a lot of the media today really driving hard on higher ed and the outcomes question and the ROI question. And really, absolutely have to focus on that. And higher ed does need to do more to facilitate better outcomes, like full stop. But they are not responsible for the job market. They're not responsible for low wages that have been stagnated and how graduates are entering a job market that maybe isn't, ready for them or is not delivering on the promise of the American Compact. And that's some of the break we're seeing today.
Kevin, I just want to follow on this stream, Charlie. So there's the job market And I agree, holding schools responsible for the job market is not the right way to go. But then you've got the Workforce Pell on the other side that seems to be, bolting that on in certain ways. And I know that a lot of the higher ed leaders that Charlie and I talk with are they're talking about how do we diversify our funding streams. You've shared that there's a philanthropy story here, and that foundations are investing in change infrastructure essentially at an accelerating pace.
Mhm.
I'd love our audience to hear from you on where some of the really interesting pilots are unfolding and what that signals about the system's capacity to self-correct.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, my research and my interest has certainly been around these kinds of intermediary organizations, and that's kind of there's no shared definition of what that means. I often call them the in between, right? But the Education Design Lab, for example, is a national intermediary that's facilitating in between employers, colleges, learners, philanthropy, policymakers, other kind of agents of systems change here. And so we're kind of at that national level. And there's been probably notable investment, at least in higher ed, in national intermediaries to help kind of move big agendas forward, right? Not long ago, there was an initiative called Intermediaries for Scale, right? And this was the idea that we have tinkered and piloted and experimented enough that we know that there are some good evidence-based models, but why aren't systems and colleges kind of picking them off the shelf and adopting them, right? Well, there's so much complexity to the various systems that one higher ed leader needs to maneuver through. For example, a community college president, who are they actually accountable to? So when I was a vice president at a community college in SUNY, it was the county government, SUNY Central, state legislature, the federal accreditors, any federal or state grant we got, programmatic or industry level accreditors. I mean, it was like everybody and no one at the same time in some ways. But I just share that as an example when I talk about the complexity that these leaders need to navigate through. And so I think there's been a recognition that intermediaries can help facilitate through the cracks in some ways, but also can help facilitate alignment towards a new vision. And that's happening at that kind of national level. In fact, I would say it could be messy feeling, but I just think that's because we're at the beginning of coalescing around what tomorrow's vision is nationally. And that's a good and exciting moment. Locally, and let's say state work, state innovation and change work, and kind of regional community level of work as well has, I think, seen a big investment over the last several years. Certainly, as the Trump administration has kind of signaled its approach, right? They're dismantling the DOE, they're kind of decentralizing a number of functions, right? So there's now a huge push down to the states. And Workforce Pell is probably a really good example of how that's playing out. When you look at Workforce Pell, it's got all these rules and criteria, but it's like, and the states will need to make all of these decisions, and the states will need to build their own data infrastructure. And so that is creating a new opportunity at the state level to advance change. And what you're seeing are some states, kind of driving ahead and other states trailing behind, as you can imagine. But it is creating an uneven playing field. I think at the regional level, what we're seeing are more investments, certainly from philanthropy, to invest in local solutions. And, we are driving and, co-leading a number of efforts, right? Whether we're supporting rural communities and specifically workforce collaboratives that are working with higher ed, but also your workforce boards, your high schools, your employer associations, right? Building that collaborative infrastructure that can better use limited resources, that could align on the vision of their community, that can norm in the data. It's kind of amazing that a lot of communities don't really look at the broader data that surrounds them, right? The labor market information, the education outcomes. You need to look at all of this so then leaders can set goals together and then organize resources against those goals. And so there's been a notable increase in investment philanthropy to support these local efforts. And we're seeing whether that's in the form of collaborative funds at a national level, like I think of the Pathways Impact Fund that was launched by Brightbound, the Walton Foundation, and the Gates Foundation, right? That's a national infrastructure funding pool to invest in local intermediaries, right? Another example would be an organization like Jobs First NYC, where I used to work. It was a New York City specific youth focused intermediary and is now taking their approach. They've now scaled to Scranton, Pennsylvania and Las Vegas, Nevada. And what they're doing is bringing that local infrastructure, they're organizing the local resources because it's not there. And so for us, we kind of have multiple ways of how we're supporting regional talent ecosystem alignment because there's just such a need to maneuver through the complexity that until something big changes nationally, these communities are faced with, kind of accessing resources and maneuvering through a 20th century policy construct that is absolutely not equipped to, again, meet the needs of this dynamic, fast changing labor market.
I want to I want to tie the several things that you mentioned here. I recognize the important intermediary, and there's certain things that you guys can do. You mentioned Workbase, you mentioned Workforce Pell. One of the challenges that we've seen is, the ability to scale, like the ripen model, as you mentioned previously as well, right? Because it's so important to learn on the job, that work base. But how do we get more employers to integrate that as part of the education, as part of onboarding, as part of talent planning? Because it can be very disruptive to the employer to bring in
Yeah.
outsiders. And I mean, I'm not even going to open up the can of worms, but I'd love for you to perhaps kind of connect the dots there for me in turn, because it's so critical to the future of learning.
Yeah, and I think there isn't going to be um, one model. That's what's really important in this moment. It's like Ripen is one leg of what should be, a multi-legged stool to a strategy, right? That's one really great opportunity to reach more learners with employer-backed projects and so on. But we're also sleeping on a whole other area, which is around service and volunteerism. And we're not kind of wrapping some of the intentionality around those experiences that with a little bit of work could be part of the strategy to help people prepare for the workforce. Colleges are often some of the biggest employers in their communities, but they don't ever look at themselves like that, right? So I just am there are three examples right there on how we need to think differently about the resources in front of us. In comes a local intermediary or some of the functions that a local intermediary could play to help ultimately align and connect these dots that I'm talking about. So it is a comprehensive strategy that needs to encompass a lot of different ways on how we do that. All of those experiences need to be grounded in the skills, competencies, and outcomes that employers need. And so you also mentioned, like, how do we get more employers to do this? Years ago, I did research across New York State trying to understand how well employers were leveraging tax credits that were trying to incentivize their hiring of young adults. And so, by no surprise, the tax credit was not a difference maker in their decision to hire the young adult, but it sweetened the deal enough for them to do it again and again and again. And by no surprise, those companies that really accessed that tax credit were the big companies that had big tax and accounting offices that could get those dollars because it required, like any tax credit would, the DOL needs to be in your business essentially to qualify that you can do that. That was a huge barrier to small businesses. And so there are more policy levers that we're not really fully using that could better incentivize and or sweeten the deal to nudge employers to come to the table. Another example, where in economic development strategies are we naming, and to what extent is probably the question, that big investments also come with expectations and responsibilities to have a career development and exploration program with your high schools, to offer a number of work-based learning opportunities and pathways with the colleges in the region, whatever the case is. So we're kind of sleeping on a number of levers that could help further facilitate employers coming to that table. And then the final thing I would say is what I'm seeing is not a lack of willingness from employers or colleges, but it's often, they're willing, they come to the table, but then they kind of just look at each other. And so part of what we've found is that just the T-Profile tool, for example, having us in the room to facilitate some of those initial conversations that get to a redesigned pathway, an updated curriculum, are really needing more guidance on how to do that with excellence. And so Again, having led a workforce division at a community college, when I got there, it was pockets of conversations with employers. But it was not an institutional strategy to engage employers the way that we were trying to when I was there.
Kevin, Education Design Lab's work is fascinating. The research that you've done on community college leaders, fascinating. Charlie and I are wonks. So, I mean, this is
100%.
awesome information. I'd say that on behalf of my kids, I'm glad you guys are out there. I'm looking forward to talking with you about regionally where you're working in community colleges, just selfishly. But thank you for joining us today. And I hope we can have you join us again sometime now that we've established this space of information. Just amazing work. Congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff and Charlie. And just on behalf of the Education Design Lab, this is a real opportunity in time to kind of facilitate and imagine what's next. And we are lockstep with our partners every day in imagining what's next and really facilitating a movement towards that vision.
Thanks, Kevin.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you both.